The dust had not yet settled on her husband's grave when the first man came to tell Georgia Quinn that she could not keep the land. She had stood there in the dry heat of a New Mexico morning in the spring of 1882, her dark hair pinned back under a worn straw hat, her boots still carrying the red clay soil from the burial site not a quarter-mile east of the main house, and she had looked that man square in the eye and told him to get off her property before she introduced him to the business end of her shotgun. He had gone. They always went at first. But she knew they would come back, and they would keep coming, because 340 acres of fertile grazing land along the upper stretch of the Pecos River was not something men in Colfax County, New Mexico, simply let a widow keep without a fight. Georgia was 28 years old. She had been married to Robert Quinn for 6 years. They had arrived in this territory together from Georgia, which is where her parents, with a particular kind of pioneer sentimentality, had drawn her name from, and they had built something out of nothing together. A house with 2 proper rooms and a wide porch. A barn that could hold 12 horses comfortably. A cattle operation that was small but steady. A vegetable patch behind the house that Georgia tended herself with a ferocity that her neighbors had always found slightly alarming. She had loved Robert, not with the wild, breathless kind of love that poets wrote about, but with the deep and practical love of 2 people who had chosen each other honestly and built a life on that choice. Robert had died from a fever in March. It had come on fast and taken him in 4 days, and Georgia had sat with him through every one of those days, and she had held his hand when he stopped breathing, and then she had walked outside and stood in the cold night air and looked up at the stars for a long time before she went back inside and started deciding what to do next. What she had decided was that she was going to keep everything they had built. The nearest town was Cimarron, about 12 miles east, and it was a rough and lively place that had seen its share of bloodshed in the years of what most people were beginning to call the Colfax County War, though that particular ugliness had faded some by now. Georgia rode into Cimarron once a week for supplies, and she kept good relations with the shopkeeper, a stout and decent woman named Margaret Alderton, and with the blacksmith, a quiet man named Hector Ruiz who shod her horses without ever overcharging her. She kept her distance from the saloons and from the men who spent too much time in them. The trouble with keeping the land was not just the men who came to her door with offers. It was the legal machinery that seemed to run against her at every turn. Robert had filed the land claim properly, but there were men in the county who had friends at the land office, and those friends had a habit of losing certain documents and finding others, and Georgia had already made 2 trips to the land office only to be told that the paperwork needed to be reviewed further, which she understood to mean that someone was waiting to see if she would give up and go somewhere easier. She would not. It was on a Wednesday in the middle of April, about 5 weeks after Robert's death, that Isaiah Vaughn rode onto her property. She saw him from a good distance because the land was flat enough here that you could see a rider coming for half a mile, and she had made it a habit since becoming a widow to watch the road. She was at the fence line at the south end of the property, checking the posts after a wind storm the previous night had knocked one of them sideways, and she straightened up and put one hand above her eyes against the bright morning sun and watched him come. He was riding a dark bay horse, tall and well-kept, which told her the man had standards. He rode without hurry but without hesitation, which told her he knew where he was going and had decided to get there. As he got closer, she could see that he was lean but broad-shouldered, that his hat was dark brown and had seen weather, and that his coat was the kind of working coat a man wore when he spent most of his time outdoors rather than behind a desk. He was not wearing the kind of clothes that the land speculators wore when they came calling, which was something. She did not move toward him, and she did not move away. She stayed at the fence post and waited. He pulled his horse up about 10 yards from her and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning," he said. "I am looking for the Quinn property. I was told in town that this was the road." "You found it," Georgia said. "I am Georgia Quinn." "What is your business?" He had a straight, steady face, dark eyes, and a jaw that was beginning to show the shadow of a few days without shaving. She guessed he was somewhere around 30, perhaps 31 or 32. There was nothing flashy about him and nothing particularly threatening either, which she noted without entirely trusting it. "My name is Isaiah Vaughn," he said. "I have been traveling from Texas. I heard there might be work in this county, and someone in Cimarron told me you had a ranch that was running short-handed." Georgia studied him for a moment. "Who in Cimarron told you that?" "Margaret Alderton at the general store," he said. "She said she knew you and that she thought you might be needing a hand. She said to tell you she sent me." Georgia's expression shifted slightly, not into warmth exactly, but into something less guarded. Margaret Alderton did not send people to her door without good reason, and Georgia trusted the woman's judgment more than almost anyone else's in this county. "I am short-handed," Georgia said carefully, "but I will be plain with you before we go any further. I have had 3 men come to this property in the past 5 weeks who said they wanted work and actually wanted to convince me to sell. I have had one man come who worked for 2 days and then went through my office papers when I was out in the pasture. And I have had one man from the land office tell me that a widow in my situation might find it easier to take the standing offer on this property than to keep fighting the county on the title question. So you will understand if I am not particularly welcoming." Isaiah looked at her steadily throughout this. "I understand that," he said. "I am not here about the land." It was such a simple thing to say. She had been bracing for something, for the sympathy play, or the legal threat softened in polite language, or the suggestion dressed up as concern. She had not been bracing for that. "Then what are you here about?" she said. "Work," he said. "I am good with cattle. I can repair fence line, I can build, I can handle horses, and I can shoe them in a pinch, though not as well as a proper blacksmith. I need wages and a place to sleep. That is the extent of my interest." Georgia was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the grass and the horse shifted its weight, and everything was still and bright and clear under the New Mexico sky. "What are you being paid in Texas?" she said. $25 a month when I could get it," he said. "I am not asking you to match that." "I will match it," she said, "if the work is good. There is a room in the barn that is better than it sounds. I put a proper floor in it 2 years ago, and it has a stove. You eat supper at the house. Breakfast you make yourself or come in if you are up before me. If you go through my papers or my desk or anything in this house that I have not invited you to touch, you will leave this property the same day. Do you have a problem with any of that?" "No, ma'am," he said. "Then put your horse in the barn, and I will show you the fence situation in the south pasture," she said, and she turned back to the post she had been working on before he arrived. He dismounted without making a production of it and led his horse toward the barn, and Georgia watched him go from the corner of her eye and thought that at least he moved like a man who had done real work before. His first week proved that out. He was up before her most mornings, which she found out because she would come out onto the porch with her coffee and find the water troughs already filled and the horses already fed. He did not do this to impress her, or if he did, he was very good at not showing it. He worked with a kind of quiet, methodical competence that she recognized because she had it herself. He fixed the fence line in the south pasture in 2 days and then moved on to the north without being told. He found a weakness in the barn roof that she had known about for months and had not had time to address, and fixed it on a Sunday when she had told him he did not need to work. He was not a talkative man. He answered questions directly when she asked them, and occasionally he said something brief and practical about the work, but he did not fill silences the way some men did, with chatter that was mostly about making themselves feel comfortable. Georgia found this restful in a way she had not anticipated. On the 8th day she asked him over supper. She made a beef stew with the dried peppers she kept in a jar by the window where he had come from before Texas. "Tennessee originally," he said. "I left when I was 18, worked in Missouri for a while, then Kansas during the trail drive years, then drifted south. Family," she said. "A sister in Memphis," he said. I write to her when I can. She married a schoolteacher, 2 children. You never married." He was quiet for a moment in the particular way that was not avoidance but consideration. "No," he said. "I have not been in one place long enough for it to make sense." Georgia nodded and didn't press further, and they finished the meal in a comfortable enough quiet. What she did not expect was the trouble that came in the second week, and it came in the form of a man named Harlan Drew. Harlan Drew was the kind of man who had decided a long time ago that the law was a tool for people who already had what they wanted to protect, and that for everyone else it was an obstacle to be managed. He ran a cattle operation about 20 miles south of Georgia's property that was twice the size of hers, and he had sent 2 of those 5 men to her door in the weeks after Robert's death. He had also, she was fairly certain, been the one to start the complications at the land office, because he had the connections and the motivation and the history of doing exactly this kind of thing to smaller landowners in the county. He came to her property on a Tuesday afternoon with 2 of his ranch hands, which was not the way a man came to make a social call. He was perhaps 50, heavy in the shoulders, with the easy confidence of a man who had been getting his way in this county for a long time. Georgia had been at the water pump near the garden when she saw them coming, and she straightened up and walked to the porch and got her rifle down from inside the door, because she was not a foolish woman. Isaiah was at the barn and he had seen them too, and he came out into the yard with the same unhurried walk he always had, and positioned himself about 20 feet to Georgia's left without saying anything or making anything obvious of it. Harlan Drew pulled up in the yard and looked from Georgia to Isaiah and back. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, pleasantly enough, "I heard you had taken on help. Good to see you are managing." "Mr. Drew," she said, "I did not invite you here." "I came as a neighbor," he said, "with a neighborly offer. I have been thinking about your situation and I believe I can improve the standing offer on this property considerably. You would walk away with enough to start fresh somewhere more comfortable." "I do not want to start fresh somewhere more comfortable," she said. "I want to stay on the land my husband and I built together. This is not a new position. I have told your representatives the same thing 3 times. Harlan Drew's pleasantness shifted a fraction. "Mrs. Quinn, the land office situation is going to take some time to resolve, and in the meantime your title is uncertain. That is just the reality of your position." "The reality of my position," Georgia said, "is that my husband filed this claim legally and paid every fee required, and the only thing standing between me and a clear title is the fact that someone with influence has decided to make it inconvenient for me. I intend to resolve that through the appropriate channels, with the appropriate legal help, which I am currently arranging." This last part was not entirely true yet, but she had been thinking about it, and saying it out loud in front of Harlan Drew felt useful. Drew looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Isaiah. "You are new here," he said. "I am," Isaiah said. "Just a working hand." "Just a working hand," Drew repeated, and there was something speculative in it that Georgia did not like. "You should know that the situation in this county can be complicated for men who find themselves on the wrong side of certain questions." Isaiah's expression did not change at all. "I appreciate the information," he said. It was said so neutrally and so calmly that it was impossible to take offense at, and yet managed to communicate very clearly that Isaiah was not impressed or afraid, and Drew seemed to understand that, because he pulled his horse around and said, "Think about the offer, Mrs. Quinn," and rode back out with his 2 men. When they were gone, Georgia let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You did not have to come out," she said to Isaiah. "I know," he said, and went back to the barn. She stood on the porch for a moment and watched the road. Then she went inside and wrote a letter to a lawyer in Santa Fe whose name Margaret Alderton had given her 2 weeks ago, and this time she actually sent it. The lawyer, whose name was Samuel Cross, replied within 10 days. He was willing to take her case on a reduced fee given the nature of it, and he believed that her claim was defensible. But it would take time, and she needed to gather every document she had related to the original filing. Georgia spent an entire evening at the kitchen table going through the metal box where Robert had kept all their important papers, and Isaiah sat near the stove and repaired a piece of harness by lamplight without being asked, and neither of them spoke much, but his presence in the room felt steadying in a way she was not quite ready to examine. "You can read, can't you?" she said at one point, not looking up from the papers. "Yes," he said. "Would you look at this?" She slid a document across the table without ceremony. "Tell me if I am reading the filing date correctly." He set down the harness and came to the table and looked at the document. He smelled of leather and clean work, she noticed, and then told herself to stop noticing things like that. "April 14th, 1876, he said. "That is what it says." "That is what I thought," she said. "That is before Drew filed his expansion claim, which means his people have been lying to the land office about the sequence." She said this with a quiet fury that was more frightening than shouting would have been. "You should tell the lawyer that specifically," Isaiah said. "I intend to," she said. He went back to the harness and she went back to the papers, and the lamp burned down, and eventually she looked up and realized it was past 10 o'clock at night, which was late for either of them. "Thank you," she said. He looked up from the harness. "For what?" "For looking at the document," she said. "For being here." She paused and then added, because she was an honest woman and honesty cost her nothing, "I did not expect it to be useful having someone here. I thought I would manage better alone." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you," he said, "manage better alone?" "No," she said, and it surprised her to say it. "But I manage well enough." He nodded, and she got up and said good night. And she went to bed and lay awake for longer than she should have, thinking about the land claim papers, and not at all about the way his eyes looked in the lamplight. The weeks turned and the work continued, and the days settled into a rhythm that Georgia found herself depending on in ways she cataloged carefully and tried not to let mean too much. She was still in the first year of her grief. She knew that. And she knew that loneliness could be deceptive, that it could dress itself up as something else and lead a person into decisions they had not thought through clearly. She had known women who had remarried in haste after losing a husband and then spent years quietly unhappy, and she had promised herself she would not be one of them. But Isaiah Vaughn was not making any kind of advance. He was not flirting with her. He was not pressing on any doors she had not opened. He was working her land, eating her cooking, talking to her when she wanted to talk and being quiet when she wanted quiet. And he was doing all of this without any apparent agenda beyond the stated one. And it was this last thing that she found most confusing, because every other man who had come to this property had wanted something beyond what he said he wanted. She asked him about it directly, because she was that kind of woman. It was a May evening, warm enough to sit on the porch after supper, which they had taken to doing in the past week. The sun was going down behind the western ridgeline, and the sky was doing the spectacular color business that New Mexico skies had a way of doing, going through pink and orange and something almost purple before settling into deep blue. "Isaiah," she said. She had started using his first name without planning to, sometime in the third week. He had started using hers in return, which she had not objected to. "Georgia," he said. "Why did you come here?" she said. "Not to this property." "I mean to this part of the territory. You are a capable man. You could have gotten work in a dozen places between Texas and here." He was quiet for a bit, looking at the sunset. "I spent a long time just going where the work was," he said. "After a while that starts to feel like something is missing. Not the going, not the work, something else." He paused. "I had a friend in Texas who told me about this county, not about you specifically, just about the land and the possibilities. He said it was rough, but it was real. I like things that are real." "Most things in the world are real," Georgia said. "Most things that people say are not," he said. She considered that. It was the most he had said about his inner life in all the weeks he had been here, and she treated it with the care it deserved by not pressing further. But she felt something shift in her chest that evening. Something small and quiet and almost unwelcome, and she watched the last of the color drain out of the sky and thought about Robert, and about the 6 years, and about the shape of the life she had ahead of her that she had not let herself think about too clearly yet. She did not say anything about the shift. It was too early and too tender, and she was not a woman who acted on half-understood feelings. June came, and with it the first real summer heat, and also, unexpectedly, the visit from a man named Thomas Alderman, who was not a threat but a problem of a different kind. Thomas Alderman was Robert's younger brother, 26 years old, and he arrived from Missouri with a horse and a saddlebag, and the particular expression of a man who believed he was doing someone a favor. Georgia had met Thomas twice before, at their wedding, and once when he had come through the territory 3 years later. She had formed the impression of a decent enough young man who was accustomed to having things arranged for him, and who did not entirely understand that other people did not share this expectation. He arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Georgia was civil and showed him the spare room in the house and made a meal, and for the first afternoon he was pleasant and walked the property with her and asked sensible questions about the cattle operation. Then, on the second day, he began a conversation that had clearly been the purpose of his visit all along. "Georgia," he said, over the noon meal. Isaiah was in the far pasture checking on the cattle, and so it was just the two of them, which was not an accident on Thomas's part, she thought. "You have done remarkably well here," Thomas said. "Robert would have been proud of how you have held this together." "Thank you," she said. "But I have been thinking," he said, "and I believe it might be time to consider what your real options are. The property is valuable. You could sell, come back to Missouri, start fresh. My mother would welcome you." "I am not going to Missouri," Georgia said pleasantly, because she had known this was coming and had prepared herself. "I have legal representation working on the title question, and I have every intention of staying." "The legal representation costs money," Thomas said. "Money you may not have in abundance." "I am managing my finances," she said. "Georgia," he said her name in a careful way that made her put down her fork. "Robert was my brother. I feel a responsibility to you. I wonder if you have considered that remarrying might simplify things considerably. There are men in Missouri—" "Thomas," she said, and her voice was entirely calm and entirely final, "I do not need a man to complete my land. This land is already complete. My claim on it is legal and documented, and I am defending it through the proper channels. I appreciate that you care about what becomes of me. I genuinely do. But the suggestion that the solution to my situation is a husband is not one I am going to entertain." Thomas opened his mouth. "I am not finished," she said, still pleasant. "You are welcome to stay as my guest for as long as you like, and I am glad to have the company of family. But we will not be returning to this subject." Thomas closed his mouth. He stayed 3 more days, and on the morning of the 4th day he saddled up and said he supposed he understood, and that he hoped things worked out, and Georgia walked him to the road and said goodbye and watched him go with a mixture of fondness and relief. She went back to the house and found Isaiah at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, which surprised her because he usually had his morning coffee in the barn. "The door was open," he said. "I thought I would wait and tell you the 2 heifers in the east pasture need to be checked. One of them looked off this morning." "All right," she said. She poured herself a cup and sat down at the table. "Did you hear any of that conversation with Thomas Alderman?" "I was not trying to listen," he said. "But did you hear it?" A pause. "Some of it," he said. She looked at her coffee. "I told him I did not need a man to complete my land." "I heard that," Isaiah said. "It is true," she said. "I believe you," he said. She looked up at him. There was something in his expression that was neither agreement nor argument, something that was just attention, clean and clear. "But," she said, because she could feel the word he had not said. "No, but," he said. "I was going to say that the land may be complete, and other things may not be. But that is none of my business, and it is not why I came here." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why did you come here?" she said, and this time she meant it differently than she had on the porch in May. He met her eyes. "I am beginning to wonder that myself," he said, "in a different way than I did before. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lay across the table between them, and Georgia felt that quiet shift again, larger now, less easy to put away. "The heifers," she said finally. "Yes," he said. "Let us go look at them," she said. And she stood up and he stood up, and they went out together into the June morning. And nothing was said that was not about cattle for the rest of that day. But something had changed between them that both of them knew had changed, and neither of them yet knew what to do with. The letter from Samuel Cross arrived the following week with better news than she had dared to hope for. He had found the original filing records in the Santa Fe office that confirmed Georgia's timeline, and he believed that, with the right presentation to the county land commissioner, they could overturn the challenge to her title within 2 to 3 months. There was still work to do, still fees to pay, still the question of whether Harlan Drew had enough influence over the commissioner to create further obstacles. But the shape of the thing had changed from desperate to difficult, and difficult was something Georgia Quinn knew exactly how to handle. She read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in the metal box and went out to the garden and worked for a straight hour without stopping, pulling weeds and staking tomato plants, and doing the physical labor that had always been how she processed good news as well as bad. Isaiah found her there in the late afternoon. He had a way of knowing where she was without appearing to look for her, which she had noticed and filed away as a thing she liked about him. "Good news," he said, because he could read her the way you read weather in the set of her shoulders and the quality of her silence. "Good news," she said. "The lawyer thinks we have a real case." He let out a breath that she realized was relief, and the fact that it was relief that he had been carrying some share of her worry without showing it moved her more than it had any right to. "Isaiah," she said. He looked at her. "Would you like to have supper on the porch tonight? I will make the chicken, and I still have a bottle of wine that Robert brought from Santa Fe 2 Christmases ago that I have been saving for a day that felt worth celebrating." He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he understood what she was really saying, which was something beyond chicken and wine. "I would like that," he said. So they had supper on the porch as the sun went down, and she opened the wine, and they drank it out of the 2 proper glasses that were among her few extravagances. And the evening was warm and full of crickets, and the far-off sound of cattle, and the wide open dark of the New Mexico sky. She told him about coming to New Mexico originally, about driving the wagon from Missouri with Robert, and the sense of everything opening up as they came into the territory, the hugeness of the sky and the color of the land, and the feeling that this was a place where you could actually see the shape of the world. He told her about being 17 in Tennessee, knowing already that what was ahead of him in that small valley where he had grown up was not enough, walking out one morning before his parents were awake with a bag and a knife and the $20 he had saved from 2 years of work, and how he had not been back since, and how he was not sorry, and how he was sometimes sorry, and how those two things existed in him at the same time without fighting. "Do you ever think about having a place?" she said. "A fixed one. I think about it more than I used to," he said. "This county could use good people," she said. "There is land to the north of mine that someone could file on." He turned his head and looked at her. The lamplight from inside was coming through the screen door, and there was enough moon to see by, and she could see his eyes very clearly. "Is that what you are suggesting?" he said. "I am making an observation about available land," she said. "Georgia," he said. "Isaiah," she said. And then she laughed, a small and genuine laugh that surprised them both because she had not laughed like that, freely and without effort, since before Robert got sick, and he smiled hearing it, and it was the first real smile she had seen from him, and it transformed his whole face into something younger and warmer than his usual steadiness. "I am trying," she said, still with the remnant of the laugh in her voice, "to not be foolish about this. I am 5 months out of grief. I do not trust myself to know the difference between what is real and what is loneliness dressed up as something else." "That is wise," he said. "But I do not think this is only loneliness," she said, and she said it plainly because she was that kind of woman. "And I suspect you do not think so either." "No," he said. I do not think so either. Then perhaps we agree, she said, to let time do what time does and not to rush it. I can agree to that, he said. Good, she said. Now tell me about Kansas. You mentioned trail drives, and I want to know what that was like because I have only ever seen the end of a drive and never the whole thing. He laughed at the change of subject, and she felt it like warmth on her skin, and they talked for another 2 hours about trail drives and cattle and the strangeness of the country and the enormous star-bright darkness around them. And when she went to bed that night, she felt lighter than she had in months. July was hard work and hot sun, and the steady progress of the herd through the summer pastures. And it was also the month that Harlan Drew made his second and more serious move against her. He had apparently gotten word through his contacts at the land office that Georgia had legal representation and that the case was not going to collapse on its own. And so he escalated, not with violence exactly, but with the kind of pressure that fell just inside the legal line. 3 of her fence posts along the southern boundary were found cut and lying flat on a Monday morning. That same Monday, a rider came from Cimarron with a message that Drew had filed a counter-complaint at the land office, claiming that the Quinn property boundary overlapped with grazing land he had been using for years. And on Tuesday, 2 of her cattle were found dead in the east pasture with no visible cause, which was not a natural death. Georgia was standing at the east pasture fence looking at the 2 dead cattle when Isaiah came up beside her. She had not cried yet. She was past the point in this fight where she cried easily. I am going to Cimarron, she said. Today, I am going to send a wire to Mr. Cross in Santa Fe, and I am going to talk to the county sheriff. I will come with you, Isaiah said. You do not have to, she said. I know, he said, which was his consistent answer to this particular sentiment. The sheriff was a man named William Ford, who was not corrupt, but was cautious in the way of a man who understood the political landscape of his county and tried to navigate it without getting destroyed. He listened to Georgia with full attention and then explained, with what she felt was genuine regret, that 2 dead cattle could have a dozen explanations and cut fence posts were hard to trace to a specific person. I am not asking you to arrest Harlan Drew today, Georgia said with great patience. I am asking you to document that I reported this and that I believe it is connected to the land dispute so that there is a record of a pattern. I can do that, Ford said. Good, she said. I would also appreciate it if you could find occasion to mention to Mr. Drew that this office is aware of the pattern. Ford studied her for a moment. You are a direct woman, Mrs. Quinn. I find it saves time, she said. Isaiah, who had been standing near the wall, made a small sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. When she glanced at him, he was looking at his hat. She sent the wire to Cross, and they rode back to the ranch in the long, golden light of the July afternoon, and somewhere around the halfway point Isaiah said, For what it is worth, I think Drew is close to overplaying his hand. Men like that usually are. What makes you say that? Because he is escalating, Isaiah said. He started with offers and moved to pressure because the offers did not work. Now he is moving to intimidation because the pressure is not working. Each escalation is an admission that the previous one failed. If you hold firm, he will eventually have to make a move that is actually illegal or back down, and either way you win. Georgia considered this. It was a clear-headed analysis, and it matched her own instinct about the situation. You have seen this pattern before, she said. In Kansas, he said. Different people, same pattern. The big operator trying to squeeze out the smaller one. It works when the smaller one is afraid or underfunded. It does not work when they are neither. Am I underfunded? She said honestly. The legal fees are real, he said, but the cattle operation is paying. I have been keeping track. He paused. I hope that is not presumptuous. I was not looking at your books. I was just observing the numbers from the work side. It is not presumptuous, she said. It is helpful. They rode in silence for a little while, comfortable with it. Thank you, she said, for coming today, for all of it. He looked at her sideways from under the brim of his hat, and there was something in that look that was warm and certain and quiet. Georgia, he said, "I know," she said. "I have not said anything yet." "I know that too," she said, "but I have gotten good at reading you." He was quiet for a moment. "Have you? You are not as hard to read as you think you are," she said. "You are just quiet. That is different from being closed." He looked at the road ahead for a moment. Then he said, "I have been thinking about what you said, about the land to the north, about this county needing good people." Georgia's heart did something careful and deliberate in her chest. "Have you?" she said. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "that I would like to stay, not just through the summer, not just through the legal trouble. I would like to stay longer than that if there is a reason to." "What kind of reason would you need?" she said, and she was watching him with everything she had. He turned and looked at her fully, right there on the road with the afternoon light all around them and the horses walking slow. "I think you know what kind," he said. She held his gaze. There was nothing bashful about her and nothing performative. She was a woman who had built her life on honesty, and she brought that same quality here. "I would like you to stay," she said. "I would like there to be a reason that keeps you here. I am not ready to say all of what that means yet, but I am not uncertain about it." "Neither am I," he said. They rode the rest of the way home in a silence that was the warmest thing she had felt in a long time. August brought the hearing at the land commissioner's office in Cimarron, which Samuel Cross came up from Santa Fe to attend in person. A tall, thin man with careful eyes and an organized briefcase who shook George's hand with the respect he would have given any client, and proceeded to present the original filing documentation in a way that was methodical and entirely persuasive. Harlan Drew's lawyer, a man who had clearly not expected the quality of the opposing presentation, stumbled twice and had to be corrected on dates by his own client, which did not make a good impression. The land commissioner, a man named Garrett, who was perhaps not entirely free of Drew's influence, but was also not willing to make an obviously wrong ruling with a Santa Fe lawyer in the room and a clear paper trail in evidence, ruled in George's favor on the boundary question and referred the title matter for formal resolution, which Cross told her afterward was essentially a victory. The formal resolution was a formality at this point. Georgia stood outside the commissioner's office in the August heat and looked up at the sky for a moment. Cross was talking about next steps. Isaiah was standing a little to her left in the way he had. "Mrs. Quinn," Cross was saying, "I expect the formal title confirmation within 6 to 8 weeks. In the meantime, your claim is protected against further challenge by today's ruling." "Thank you, Mr. Cross," she said. "Truly." When Cross went off to arrange his return journey, Georgia turned to Isaiah. There was a quality to the moment that she felt in her whole body, the release of months of tension, the particular sweetness of having held on until holding on had meant something. "We should celebrate," she said. "We should go back to the ranch," he said, "and I will cook supper this time because you have been cooking for 4 months and you deserve one night where someone else does it." She stared at him. "You cook? I have fed myself for 12 years on the road," he said with a small, dry amusement. "I cook." "Then I accept," she said. He cooked a venison stew with dried herbs and fresh biscuits that were better than she would have expected, and she ate 2 helpings on the porch with the evening cool coming on, and told him so without embarrassment. And he seemed genuinely pleased, and she thought that it was a remarkable thing. The way 2 people could build an intimacy out of shared meals and shared work and shared trouble and shared silences, until one day it was simply the architecture of your daily life, and you could not easily imagine the structure without it. It was in September, 2 weeks before the formal title confirmation arrived, that he kissed her. She had not been anticipating it, which was unusual for her because she was an anticipatory person. They had been in the barn together in the late afternoon, doing the evening feed, and she had turned from the hay bale with an armload and found him very close, closer than the practical distance of the work required, and they had both stopped. The hay was suspended between them, absurdly, and they were both aware of the absurdity of it, and she saw in his face everything she had been reading for months made suddenly explicit. The steadiness was still there, because it was always there in him, but beneath it was something that had nothing to do with steadiness and everything to do with her. She put the hay down. He stepped closer, and she did not step back, and the barn was full of the warm smell of horses and hay and clean work. And when he kissed her, it was careful and certain at the same time, which was exactly how everything about him was. She kissed him back with the same quality of care and certainty, and her hand came up to his jaw where the stubble was, and she felt his hand come to her waist with a gentleness that asked rather than assumed. They stayed like that for a long moment. When they broke apart, she looked at him with clear eyes, and he looked at her with the same. "I am aware," she said very calmly, "that I said I did not need a man to complete my land." "I know," he said. "I was never here about the land." "I know you were not," she said. "I have known that for a long time." "Then what are you saying?" he said with a very slight smile. "I am saying that the land is complete," she said, "and that other things are not. And that I believe I am ready to say more about what that means than I was in June." "Are you ready to say it now?" he said. She thought about it honestly, which was how she did everything. "I think," she said, "that I would like to say it slowly. But I want to start." He nodded. "Then let us start," he said. And so they did. The formal title confirmation from the land office arrived on the 22nd of September, 1882, in an official envelope with the New Mexico territorial seal, and Georgia Quinn sat at her kitchen table and read it 3 times and then folded it carefully and placed it in the metal box where it belonged. The Quinn Ranch. 340 acres along the Upper Pecos. Hers without condition or encumbrance. She walked outside and stood on the porch and looked out over the land, which was going through its autumn colors now, the grass shifting from summer green to the tawny gold it turned in October, and the mountains in the distance wearing their first thin frost on the higher peaks. Isaiah came out of the barn and crossed the yard and came up the porch steps and stood beside her without saying anything, because he knew her well enough by now to know when she needed to stand with something in silence before she could speak it. They stood there together for a long time. "Robert would have been happy," she said finally. "This was his dream too, I want to say that. I do not want to pretend that it is only mine." "It does not have to be only yours," Isaiah said quietly. She turned and looked at him. 6 months ago she had been standing at a fence post watching a stranger ride toward her on a dark bay horse, and she had been alone with her grief and her determination and her 340 acres, and she had not imagined, truly had not imagined, that she would be standing here in September with this particular feeling in her chest, this particular man beside her. "Isaiah," she said. "Georgia," he said. "I love you," she said. "I am aware it is perhaps quicker than people expect these things to be said, and I am aware of everything that means. But I am not a woman who lets the truth sit unsaid because it is inconvenient." He looked at her, and the thing in his face was complete and entirely certain. "I love you too," he said. "I have been fairly sure of it since July, and certain of it since August, and I have been waiting for you to be ready to say it first because that is the kind of thing that needed to come from you." "That is exactly right," she said. He reached over and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood on the porch of the house she had built with Robert and was now keeping for herself, and the land was hers, and she was no less herself for loving him. October came in cool and golden and busy. They had the fall cattle work to get through, which was hard and satisfying labor, and Georgia had begun thinking about expanding the herd in the spring, and Isaiah had quietly filed a claim on a modest parcel of land to the north of hers, not because he intended to leave her ranch, but because he wanted something in his own name in this country, a stake, a declaration that he meant to stay. Georgia thought this was exactly the right thing to do and told him so. Margaret Alderton, when Georgia came into Cimarron for supplies in late October, looked at her face for approximately 3 seconds and said, "Well, I am glad he worked out." "He worked out," Georgia said. "He is a good man," Margaret said. "I can read people. It is my particular gift. Will there be a wedding?" Georgia considered this with the same honest care she brought to everything. "I believe so," she said. "In the spring perhaps, when the ground has had some time." "The ground has had enough time," Margaret said with the confidence of a woman who had seen a great many people come and go through her store and who understood the mathematics of the heart as well as the mathematics of supplies. "But that is your decision to make," Georgia smiled. "Yes," she said, "it is." The winter was the kind of winter that tested people who lived on the land in the New Mexico territory, with cold that came earlier than expected, and a January blizzard that kept them both close to the house for 4 days. Isaiah had long since moved from the barn room into the second room in the house, which had been George's sewing room, in a proper and practical arrangement that the neighbors probably had opinions about, and which neither of them lost any sleep over. During the blizzard, they played cards and read aloud to each other from the 2 books on George's shelf, and talked for hours about things they had not had the concentrated time to talk about before. His childhood in Tennessee, the river and the hills and the particular green of that place and how he had loved it and left it all at once. Her childhood in Georgia, the state, the family farm and her 4 brothers and the way she had always felt that she was thinking in a different direction from everyone around her. "I never thought I would end up here," she said on the second evening, watching the snow through the window. "Neither did I," he said. "But I think I was heading here all along without knowing the direction." "Do you believe in things like that?" she said. "In directions you do not know you are taking?" "I did not used to," he said. "I was fairly convinced that things happened because you made them happen or because they happened to you, and there was not much more to it than that." He looked at her. "I am less convinced of that now." She felt the warmth of that look through the whole of the cold day. They were not reckless with each other. They were tender and careful and real. There was something between them that did not need testing or drama to prove itself, that simply was what it was, as solid and particular as the land outside. On the 3rd day of the blizzard they were sitting by the stove, Georgia with her mending and Isaiah with a book, when he looked up and said, "Georgia, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that the answer does not change anything essential." She set down the mending. "Ask," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. He said it straightforwardly, without theater, with his dark, steady eyes on her face and everything genuine in his expression. She looked at him for a moment, at this man who had come to her fence line in April on a dark bay horse, and who had fixed her fence and eaten her cooking, and stood at her side through the legal fight and kissed her in the barn, and told her he loved her on the porch and meant every word of everything he had ever said to her. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He crossed the room and took both her hands in his, and she stood up from her chair, and they stood together by the stove with the blizzard outside and the warm, small house around them, and she thought that it was the most herself she had felt in years. They were married in Cimarron on the 15th of March, 1883, which was almost exactly 1 year after Robert Quinn had died, and Georgia acknowledged this timing without guilt or apology, because she did not believe that love was a betrayal of love, and because she believed Robert would have wanted her to be happy, and because the land was hers and she was fully herself, and Isaiah Vaughn loved her for every part of that. Margaret Alderton came to the wedding and cried, which surprised everyone including Margaret. The sheriff, William Ford, came and shook Isaiah's hand with what seemed like genuine goodwill. Hector Ruiz, the blacksmith, came with his wife and brought a hand-forged set of tools as a gift that Isaiah clearly treasured above most things. Samuel Cross sent a letter from Santa Fe offering his congratulations and the information that Harlan Drew had sold his southern operation and moved to Colorado, which Georgia read aloud at the reception to general satisfaction. They went back to the ranch the same evening, because there was always work to do, and they were both people who preferred home to spectacle, and Isaiah carried her over the threshold of the house in the old tradition, which she had told him was not necessary, and he had done anyway with a grin that showed the younger, warmer version of himself she had been seeing more and more of since autumn. She laughed going through the door and landed in the house and stood there looking at him with the marriage ring new on her finger and everything settled and real around them. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. "Now what?" she said. "Now," he said, "we run this ranch." She put her arms around him, and he put his arms around her, and she thought of the spring ahead, and the expanded herd, and the new fence line they had been planning, and the filing she intended to make on a second water access point that would secure the ranch against drought for decades. And she felt all of it as possibility and abundance rather than burden, the way the land had always felt to her on its best days. The spring of 1883 was warm and early and extraordinarily good for grass, which meant good grazing and a healthy herd, and the Quinn Ranch, which everyone in the county still called that, and which Georgia kept calling that because it was hers and had been built partly by Robert's hands, and she did not erase the history that had made the place, expanded its cattle operation by a third. Isaiah was a full partner in every sense, though they had agreed to keep the legal title in Georgia's name for now, for practical reasons that had to do with the earlier legal fight and the protections they had put in place, and he had not objected to this for one moment. He also kept building on his own parcel to the north, a small but well-constructed cabin and a barn, not because he needed it, but because he believed in having something to your own name. Georgia respected this immensely. In July, Georgia told him that she was expecting a child. She told him in the evening on the porch, because that was where they told each other the important things, and she watched his face go through a sequence of emotions that was remarkable in a man usually so contained. Surprise, and then something that was not quite joy yet but was on its way, and then a kind of stunned and wondering quality that she had not seen in him before. "You are certain," he said. "Yes," she said. He put his hand over hers on the arm of the rocking chair carefully, as if the fact of it was something physical that needed to be handled with care. "Isaiah," she said, "say something." "I am trying to," he said. "I am finding that what I want to say does not quite fit in the words I have available." She laughed at that, the full, free laugh that had surprised them both on the porch in June the previous year. "Then do not say it," she said. "I can see it." He raised her hand and pressed it to his lips, and she felt the warmth of that gesture all the way through to the bones of her hand and up her arm and into her chest where it settled. "A child," he said. Not as a question, just as a thing he was making real by naming it. "Yes," she said. He was a wonderful man to be expecting a child with, it turned out, not hovering and not dismissive, which were the two failure modes she had observed in other men. He paid attention without making her feel managed. He took on more of the physical work without making it into something she owed him for. He talked to her about the child, about what they hoped, about what it would mean to raise a person on this land with these values, and these conversations were among the best they had. In October, Georgia's mother came from Georgia the state for a month, a wiry and sharp-eyed woman of 60 who assessed Isaiah Vaughn over the first dinner and then pronounced him, very firmly, adequate, which Georgia's mother meant as high praise and which Isaiah understood perfectly. He also rode 12 miles to Cimarron one morning in November to wire Georgia's mother's family about the pregnancy, without being asked to, because he had overheard Georgia saying she wanted to let them know but had not had time to make the trip. And when Georgia found out, she stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on her stomach and felt so much love for this man that it was almost a physical weight. "You did not have to do that," she said. "I know," he said. The baby was born on the 28th of February, 1884, in the main room of the Quinn Ranch house with Margaret Alderton serving as midwife and Isaiah in the barn, because Georgia had told him to go to the barn, because she did not want him pacing in the house, and she heard later from Margaret that he had checked the door approximately 12 times in 4 hours. It was a boy. Georgia lay in the bed afterward with the child on her chest, wrung out and triumphant in the way that women who have done an enormous and exhausting and extraordinary thing are triumphant, and Isaiah came in finally and sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son with an expression that she kept in her heart for the rest of her life. "He is real," Isaiah said. He said it with a kind of wonder that was unlike anything she had heard from him. "Very real," she said. "What shall we call him?" They had talked about names, in the way of expecting parents who cannot quite commit until the person is actually in front of them, and she looked at the small wrinkled face of her son and the dark hair and the clenched fists and said, "Robert Isaiah Vaughn." Isaiah looked at her. "For both of them," she said. "For the man who helped build this land and the man who is keeping it with me." He did not say anything for a moment. When he looked up from the baby, his eyes were wet, which was the only time in all the time she had known him. "All right," he said. "Robert Isaiah Vaughn." Robert, they called him Robert at home, and Bobby when he was being particularly demanding, which became more frequent as he began to walk, and then to run, and then to have opinions about everything, was a child of this land in the way that Georgia had always hoped for. Dark-haired and stubborn and curious, with his father's steady dark eyes and his mother's way of looking at the horizon as if calculating what was beyond it. He took his first steps on the porch of the house, and his first fall onto the packed clay of the yard, and got up without crying, which Georgia observed with pride and Isaiah observed with a smile that was half astonishment and half recognition. Life on the Quinn ranch in those years was full and real and sometimes hard, and always grounded in the particular satisfaction of work that meant something. The herd grew. The water access filing came through, giving them the drought security Georgia had planned for. Isaiah's northern parcel was fully built out, and they occasionally rented it to passing families for a modest income. Margaret Alderton's store remained their anchor in Cimarron, and the two women's friendship deepened into the kind of thing that outlasted circumstances. The larger political troubles of the territory moved around them without landing directly again. The Colfax County conflicts had mostly settled into an uneasy but functional peace by the mid-1880s, and the Land Office, under new management following a territorial review, had cleaned up some of its more egregious practices. Georgia heard through Margaret that Harlan Drew's Colorado operation had also run into trouble, though she did not waste much time thinking about him. In the spring of 1886, Georgia found out she was expecting their second child, and she told Isaiah on the porch, same as before, and his face went through the same remarkable sequence, though this time he also laughed, which he had not done the first time. "You are less surprised this time," she said. "I am equally glad," he said. The second child was a girl, born in December of 1886, and they named her Clara May Vaughn, for Isaiah's mother, who had died when he was 15 and whose middle name had been May. Georgia had suggested this name herself, because she understood what it meant to carry the people who were gone forward in the living, and Clara May was a round-faced and sunny baby who smiled at everything, and reduced her father to a state of helpless softness that Georgia found immensely entertaining. Robert, who was nearly 3 by the time Clara arrived, greeted his sister with the cautious suspicion of a small person who has been the center of attention and suspects this is about to change. But within a week, he was leading her to things by her tiny fist and saying, "Look, look," about horses and dogs and the chickens, and Georgia watched her children together on the porch floor and felt the fullness of the life she had made as a concrete and breathable thing. The years moved in the way of years on a working ranch, with their seasons and their demands, their joys and their small griefs, their rhythm of labor and rest, and the long conversation of a marriage between two people who respected each other. Georgia Quinn was not a changed woman from the woman who had stood at the fence post in April of 1882 and watched a stranger ride toward her on a dark bay horse. She was the same woman, with the same directness and the same ferocity and the same clear sense of who she was and what she was building. What had changed was the architecture around her. The land was hers, fully and finally, in the metal box with the territorial seal. The house was fuller. The porch conversations were the best part of every day. Isaiah Vaughn was not a changed man either, not in his essential nature. He was still quiet and steady and competent and honest, still the man who got up before her to water the horses and fix things without being asked, and said exactly what he meant without decoration. What had changed was the fact of being fixed, of belonging to something specific and chosen and real, and this had done something to the quality of his steadiness, deepened it, given it a warmth that had always been there but now had somewhere to go. On an evening in September of 1888, which was exactly 6 years after the title confirmation had arrived in its official envelope, they were sitting on the porch after supper, Robert and Clara asleep inside, the cattle quiet in the pasture, the sky doing its extravagant New Mexico color work, and Georgia was in her rocking chair and Isaiah was in his, and the ranch spread out before them in the last of the evening light. 340 acres and the water right in the north parcel, every fence post and every blade of grass exactly where it was supposed to be. "I have been thinking," Georgia said. "About what?" Isaiah said. "About how it started," she said. "You came to that fence line and you said you had heard there was work, and I asked you what your business was and you said you were just a working hand." "I was," he said, "at the time. And I told Thomas Alderman that I did not need a man to complete my land," she said, "which is still true. The land is completely itself," he agreed. "And you told me you had not come about the land," she said. He looked at her in the evening light across the 6 years of everything that had followed. "I had not," he said. "No," she said, "you had not." She reached across the space between the chairs and put her hand in his. His hand closed around hers in the way it always had, careful and certain and warm. The sun went the rest of the way down, and the stars came out over the Quinn ranch one by one, and the night settled in, and they sat there together in the dark with their children asleep inside and their land all around them and the long, wonderful, ordinary, extraordinary life they had built between them. And Georgia Quinn felt, as she had felt on the best mornings and the best evenings of the past 6 years, completely and entirely herself, not completed by him, herself with him, which was exactly what it was supposed to be. In the years that followed, the Quinn Ranch became one of the established and respected operations in Colfax County, known for the quality of its cattle and the reliability of its owners. Georgia expanded the vegetable operation in the early 1890s and began selling produce to Cimarron's growing population, a second income stream that she managed with the same brisk competence she brought to everything. Isaiah became involved in a county cattlemen's association, representing the smaller operators whose interests were not always aligned with the larger ranches, and he did this with the same steady, undramatic effectiveness that characterized everything he did. Robert grew into a serious and capable boy who took to the land with an instinct that his parents recognized without fully understanding, since it had come from somewhere beyond either of them. By the time he was 12, he could ride anything in the pasture and had opinions about cattle breeding that were not entirely wrong. He had his father's eyes and his mother's jaw and a stubbornness that was pure Quinn, whatever its exact origin. Clara was a different creature entirely, bright and social, and inclined toward the wider world in a way that her parents watched with interest and mild wonder. She loved to read anything that came through Cimarron, and she asked questions about places she had only seen in the papers, and Georgia encouraged this without reservation, because she believed that the world was large, and that curiosity about it was not a betrayal of the land but a right that any child deserved. Margaret Alderton came to supper at the Quinn Ranch approximately once a month throughout these years, and was a fixture of the family's life in the way that certain people become fixtures, irreplaceable, and taken for granted in the best sense. She watched the children grow and offered her opinions on all things, which the children found exciting and the parents found mostly accurate. Hector Ruiz retired from the blacksmith trade in 1891, and his son took over, and Georgia made a point of bringing all the ranch's shoeing work to the Ruiz shop as she always had, and when she heard that the elder Ruiz had been having some difficulty with his property, writes a smaller version of the same trouble she had faced in 1882. She connected him with Samuel Cross in Santa Fe, who had continued to do good work in the territory. The letter she got from Robert Quinn's brother Thomas came in 1892, a decade after his somewhat awkward visit, and it was a gracious and somewhat abashed letter in which he said he hoped she was well, and that he understood now that she had been right about everything, and that he was glad she had stayed and built what she had built. She wrote him back a kind letter, because she was not a woman who held grudges, and they began a proper correspondence that continued. On the evening of their 10th wedding anniversary in March of 1893, Isaiah brought a bottle of wine to the porch. They had maintained the tradition of wine on notable evenings, though the bottle Robert had brought from Santa Fe was long since a memory, and they sat as they always sat and looked out over the land. 10 years, Georgia said. 10 years, he said. Are you happy? She said. She asked it directly, as she always had, because she believed that happiness was not a thing to be assumed, but a thing to be confirmed between people who cared about the truth. He looked at her. His hair had a touch of gray at the temples now that she found extraordinarily becoming. Her own dark hair had 2 white strands at the left side that she did not bother to conceal. I am happier than I knew how to imagine being, he said, when I left Tennessee at 18 with $20 and a knife. She laughed her full free laugh. That is a very specific comparison. I am being precise, he said. And are you happy right now, she said. Not comparing to Tennessee. Right now on this porch with these children and this land and this woman. He took her hand in the gathering dark. Yes, Georgia, he said. Right now on this porch, everything about right now. She rested her head against his shoulder, which she did not do often because she was not by nature a leaning person. But she did it tonight because tonight was their 10th year, and because the land was theirs and the children were asleep inside, and the stars were coming out over the picos and she wanted to. He put his arm around her, and they sat like that in the March evening, and the quiet of the ranch settled around them. The cattle and the horses and the grass and the fence posts, and the house they had filled with living, and the long open sky above all of it. I am going to need more fence posts in the south section, she said into his shoulder. He laughed a real laugh, and she felt it against her. I know, he said. I checked them last week. Of course you did, she said. First thing tomorrow, he said. Good, she said. The stars came out one by one over the Quinn ranch, and the night was warm for March, and everything was exactly and entirely as it should be. And Georgia Quinn, who had stood at a fence post one April morning 11 years before, and told a stranger what she did and did not need, held the hand of the man who had never been there about the land and felt the fullness of all of it. The past and the present and the long future stretched out ahead of them on their 340 acres along the upper picos, and she was grateful, deeply and simply grateful, for every part of the story that had brought her to this porch, to this man, to this particular and perfect life.